Hi, this is Michael with the implementation staff, and today I'm going to be going over some workflow rules in regards to the difference between an event completion rule and a event selection rule. So within our workflow configuration, once we open that and we go into, for this example, I'm going to be using the calibration event. But what we're really going to be talking about are steps 9 and 10 within the workflow configuration. So step 9 is event completion rules. These are rules that need to be in place in order for an event to be completed versus step 10, which is an event selection rule. This is a check to make sure that information is present before you can actually add the item into whatever event you set up. So here I have an item under ABC Company that looks like it might have some basic information in here. But it might not necessarily have everything that we would like to have if we're launching a calibration. So for example, this one is missing a serial number, has no description, the service by is blank, the cert template's blank, and our cal procedure is blank as well. So right now, if I were to come in, I could add this item into my calibration event since I have my add current equipment rule in. And what we end up with is we've got a bunch of stuff that ends up being blank and can cause some issues. For example, the vendor being blank means that the certificate number will not auto-populate whenever you add that item in. So what we could do here is to make sure that information is present for the calibration event, we could go into our workflow configuration and add selection rules. From the plus icon, we can add selection rules. Now, if you have a few different selection criteria, you may want separate rules versus one large rule to indicate to the user what the failure message would be. So for this one, we're going to have our serviced by. And so what we have is our failure message that would pop up if we try and add this item and don't have that field set. So right here, equipment can only be selected for this event if, and then what we would do is if we want the value to not be blank, we would say service by is not blank or empty. Additionally, let's also do one for a cal procedure. And then we'll do a final one for serial number. One additional thing that I find really useful in here, depending on what you're using the events for, is also to select this only allow equipment from one company. This can be very useful in some cases to make sure that, for example, a commercial calibration lab doesn't accidentally add an item from a different company to a return equipment order. So I'm going to go ahead and save and reload those settings. Go back to my last piece of equipment that I was working on. And so let's say I filled in my serial number right here, but then I try and go and add that item to my calibration event now. What we're going to get is our alert messages. And if you notice, we did not get the serial number because it met the selection criteria, but we did get our one that says that we've missed our cal procedure and service by field. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to fill in my service by and my cal procedure. Save those changes and launch that calibration event. And now that item can come in. If you notice, now our vendor has populated because we had that set to autofill, and therefore our cert number can be auto-generated as well. Now, from here, the selection rules allow us to make sure that information is required before we start the work. The difference between a selection rule and a completion rule is going to be now, if I wanted to try and go to the very end and click finish on this event, and we don't have something that is dual entry into our fields. And so from here, with our completion rule not in place, if we pull up our certificate again, you'll notice that our temperature and humidity are 0, our description is blank. That might have been a better selection rule, but temp and humidity are blank. We have no masters that were required. And these can generally cause issues for your auditors if they find certificates with missing information. So what we could do is within our workflow configuration, we could go into our step 9 for event completion rules. So in here, we're going to have something very similar to how the selection rules are, except on this right side, we'll have the ability to look at event information as well. So let's have a temperature check. So our rule right here could say our temperature must be between 63 and 73 Fahrenheit, so 68 plus or minus 5. And on this left side, we can set things such as equipment rules. So say, for example, a dimensional item, you may want that to be between 67 and 69, so that way you're in a 68 plus or minus 1 Fahrenheit, but that may not be applicable for your electronic calibrations or other. So you may filter it based off of equipment type or an attribute set. But on this right side, we could add an event rule. So this is where we are triggering the rule failure here. So what we could do here is, I'm just going to call the rule temp, and require that the temperature is F and the temperature value is going to be between 63 and 73. Additionally, here we could also set the temperature type to accommodate if you did any Celsius as well. So that would be about 17.5 and 22.5. And we can change that to an OR. This way we don't end up with someone calibrating at 68 Celsius or 20 Fahrenheit. So once we have our completion rule there, we can save and reload. Then we can launch back into our calibration event. Obviously, I'm not using a selection rule for my tracking status right now like I should be. But in here, if we put, say for example, our 68 Celsius example that we would never be able to calibrate at, and try and finish that, we are going to get our error message that says, or not really error message, but our completion rule that says that it must be between 63 and 73 F, and stop us from finishing that calibration. Again, this is something that an auditor could provide a finding on if you calibrated something at 68C instead of 68F. One thing that I like to do that is a little conditional based is I typically like using the completion rules for data that needs to be evaluated. So on this one, we've got our rule for our temperature being between 63 and 73 F, or 17.5 and 22.5 Celsius. If we wanted to check and ensure that something is blank, what we could do instead is actually use our security settings. So within this event, I have a user-defined 1 set for my as found and user-defined 2 set for my as left. And I could come into my security settings. Typically, I also like seeing that by all, and scrolling down here to my user-defined 1. I could use this box here. Right now I'm just going to check all of them for user 1 and require field for user 2. What that would allow is a requirement that the field is not blank or empty. So if we also set the validation rules for the drop-down list, then we could make sure that someone has chosen a proper field. So we'll go 20C on this one. And now if I try and finish this event, we are going to see a warning that our asFound field is required and our asLeft field is required, and those are not going to be anything that can be passed through until there's some value. So one thing that we may want to do is ensure that we are looking at a validation list. So to review, our event selection rules can be used to ensure that information is in place before an event is started. Our event completion rules can be used to look at a conditional set of data, or could be used to prevent a blank or empty field. And if it is not something that is conditional, we're just preventing a blank or empty field, we could also use our security settings in order to require those fields, such as this line here. If anyone has any questions, feel free to reach out to us, and we'd be happy to help. Thank you.